Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to chair this program and to be your host for the next 2 days. In our conference, TMI at 35, the 3 Mile Island Nuclear Crisis in Perspective, Analysis, Stories, and Policies, several parts of the Pennsylvania State University are joining forces with external experts to address the 35th anniversary of the TMI crisis of 1979, and Friday tomorrow will in fact mark the very anniversary of that crisis, of the accident, centered on challenges for civil security and the ways complex catastrophic events have been and continue to be attended to by government officials at all levels, first responders, industry experts, scholars, activists, and the public at large. We are so glad you all had a chance to come and be here today. We look forward to dynamic debates and vivid exchange of views, but since we are on academic soil here, I would like to encourage you to speak to your cause and not to speak against a person. We're obviously not going to rewrite the history of TMI in 1979 here, since we were even inspired, as the title of our event indicates, by the seminal contribution of Sam Walker, entitled 3 Mile Island, A Nuclear Crisis in Historical Perspective. However, since civil security research studies substantially include exploring perception and emotion, we are excited to have an oral history panel later today as part of the program, where among others, Sam Walker will share his personal experience in writing his book of the history of the TMI crisis. We are excited to have the vast majority of actors of 1979 at our conference. A couple of them are already able to be here today. Some others will be able to join tomorrow. Former Governor Thornburgh, Mr. Reed, former Mayor of Middletown Borough, Mr. Malloy, Dauphin County Civil Defense Director at the time of the accident, Harold Denton, President Carter's personal advisor during the TMI accident, Congressman Walker, and colleagues and citizens who lived in the area of Harrisburg at the time of the accident. There have been seminal revisits of the TMI accident, including by Penn State scholars. For example, Bonnie Ossoff and colleagues in 2004 published TMI 25 years later, 3 Mile Island Nuclear Power Plant Accident and its Impact. That book highlighted the impact of TMI in terms of changing perception of the risks versus benefits of technology and the need for comprehensive technology assessment. In an era of homeland security, we are confronted with similar questions regarding the field of security technologies, from body scanners to unmanned aerial systems, commonly known as drones, and beyond, and what benefits versus risks they offer when it comes to security. While homeland security today, also as we teach it in our programs, happens in the context of an all-hazard approach that, among other things, includes emergency management, some may wonder why 3 Mile Island is a subject of interest in homeland security and why homeland security programs of Penn State Harrisburg are organizing this event together with colleagues from relevant schools. There are a couple of answers to this question. In fact, TMI was addressed early on in regard to terrorist threat. Only 3 years after the accident, in 1982, Gray and Rosen published their book on the warning, Accident at 3 Mile Island, a Nuclear Omen for an Age of Terror. An organizational answer to the question of how TMI relates to homeland security is provided by looking at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It today is a well-known component of the Department of Homeland Security, but it owes its existence to 3 Mile Island to a large extent. While foreseen in the Reorganization Plan number 3 of 1978, it was activated by an executive order from President Carter of the 1st of April 1979, following the TMI accident. Another and a very practical answer why TMI is a subject of interest in Homeland Security is found in the Governor's Guide to Homeland Security that the National Governors Association released some years ago. That guide focuses on the all-hazard approach as well and on a comprehensive approach to incident response, regardless of the character and source of that incident, as an important part of the Homeland Security enterprise and its joint responsibility to deliver security to citizens and foster a resilient nation. The guide starts with a section on the challenge of Homeland Security governance, citing the multiple challenges that you, sir, Governor Thornburgh, were facing in the TMI crisis. Citation, just 71 days into his term, Governor Thornburgh found himself in the national spotlight and was expected to serve expertly as the leader in a litany of complicated duties. Commander-in-Chief of the state forces responding to the incident, Chief Executive Officer of the government, Chief Communicator to a worried public, and Chief Liaison to the governors of neighboring states and to the federal government. Now it is my honor to introduce our opening keynote speaker, who in fact does not need introduction. Dick Thornburgh is currently counsel to the international law firm of K&L Gates, resident in its Washington, D.C. office. He previously served as governor of Pennsylvania, as Attorney General of the United States under Presidents Reagan and George Bush Sr., and Undersecretary of the United Nations during a public career which in fact spanned over 25 years. Following the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, Governor Thornburgh was described by observers as one of the few authentic heroes of that episode, as a calm voice against panic. Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Thornburgh established strong ties with law enforcement agencies around the world to help combat drug trafficking, money laundering, terrorism, and international white-collar crime. An honorary special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he chaired a panel on the National Academy of Public Administration examining the FBI's post-9/11 transformation process and served as a member of the FBI Directors Advisory Board. So here again we see a clear linkage of Governor Thornburgh's career and the challenges of Homeland Security and a comprehensive approach as we face it today. During his service as Undersecretary General at the United Nations, he substantially contributed to the reform of United Nations peacekeeping and humanitarian and development programs. Mr. Thornburgh received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Lawyer magazine for important contributions to public life while building an outstanding private practice. He was educated at Yale University, where he obtained an engineering degree, and at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He served as the director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Mr. Governor, once again, welcome to Penn State, and this is your audience.
Thanks very much, Alex.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and particularly to have this kind of alumni gathering that I see so many familiar faces around this hall here today. And particularly, I didn't see, is Harold Denton here? There he is. My goodness, my old sidekick. This man is I've always described as the true hero of the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, because he, as I will develop a little bit more in detail, he was a savior for this area. So Mayor Bob Reed, who's an old colleague and friend who was right on the front lines when all of this went down. And I'm not going to take the time to identify each and every one of you, but it is good to be here, and it's a worthwhile endeavor, I think, to look back on this incident and the challenges it posed, and some of the things that we did that turned out okay, and some didn't turn out okay, but we'll get into that in more detail. I wanted to tell you just how I came to speak here today. I had a phone call from the Chancellor saying that he knew that I was a lawyer, that I had been very much interested in the rule of law and very much interested in human rights and in freedom for various people. He said, I want to ask you something. And I said, yes, sir. He said, do you still believe in free speech? And I said, yes, I do. He said, well, how about coming to Harrisburg and giving one? He's much more charitable than that, you can tell, because in introducing me, he, without referring to the fact that we pulled into dock here a little bit tardy, he said, we're glad to have you all here this evening. And I think he was afraid I might not show up until the wee small hours of the night. Well, let me, first of all, acknowledge that it is not easy for me ever to forget that date 36 years ago, 35 years ago tomorrow, when we in state government were called upon to deal with something that had never occurred on the face of the earth before, the threat of a nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island Nuclear Plant, not far from our state capital in Harrisburg, where I was lodged a scant 72 days before this event occurred. And I've been asked to share with you some of the lessons learned by this governor from that event, in spite of the fact that it occurred so shortly after my taking office. I had a crash course, and I'm pleased to join you today to share that. Let's begin at the beginning. March 28, 1979. There's only one thing on my mind at 7:50 a.m. that morning, and it was not how to deal with a nuclear crisis. I was vitally interested in securing passage of my first state budget and had made a strategic decision to host a breakfast meeting at the governor's residence to seek some support from Democratic members of the House. I'm a Republican, as some of you may know. I don't know. But this was a reaching across the aisle exercise, and we were really quite excited about developing some bipartisan support for our fiscal plan. At 7:50 a.m., however, a phone call from the State Director of Emergency Management interrupted our meeting. He told me that there had been an accident at the 3 Mile Island Nuclear Power Plant, which I knew was just 10 miles downstream from the governor's residence in the middle of the Susquehanna River. I knew immediately that our ambitious agenda for developing bipartisan support for the budget was out the window, and that our schedule for the balance of the week at least was likely to be rudely amended overtaken by events, I think is the way to put it. And what happened in the next 5 days, of course, is history. And I won't try not to bore you with the details, but secondly, don't eliminate anything that will increase your understanding of what the environment was at the time and what challenges remain today. This all began at 4 o'clock in the morning on March 28, 1979, when vital cooling water to this plant was escaping through a valve that had opened at one of the 2 nuclear reactors at the plant. For the next 2.25 hours, plant operators failed to read these symptoms correctly, failed to close the valve, and mistakenly shut off an emergency cooling system that otherwise would have operated automatically. The reactor core overheated, and the worst accident in the history of commercial nuclear power in the United States was well underway by sunup of that day. We now know that while some of the reactor fuel heated to the point of melting, a disastrous meltdown, as suggested by the popular movie The China Syndrome, was not going to be a part of the scenario unfolding here. We know now that while there were detectable amounts of radiation escaping into our air and water during these days, the amounts were limited and the impact on public health, if any, remains debatable. And we now know that a massive evacuation of up to 200,000 people residing in this area and its accompanying potential for panic, for injury, and even loss of life could have been far more dangerous and damaging than the accident itself, given the conditions at the time. In any event, when I answered that phone at 7:50 a.m., I knew none of this. And we really were beginning to just get a feel for the office itself. Nuclear power at this time was the technological marvel of our time, to some the ultimate answer to our growing energy problems, a source of electricity once allegedly described as too cheap to meter, and an industry whose safety record had been, or at least was thought to have been, second to none up to that time. I had neither reason nor inclination to challenge these assumptions, except perhaps the one about my light bill being too cheap to meter. Nuclear jargon was a foreign language to me, and my exposure to emergency management at a nuclear power plant was limited to a perfunctory briefing just after I took office. I knew enough, however, that the thought of issuing a general evacuation order first entered my mind at 7:50 a.m. that morning and never left me throughout the unprecedented days that followed. On the first day, it was not yet clear that the governor would have to personally manage the civilian side of this crisis, but it was very clear that a new administration with ultimate responsibility for public health and safety had better start asking questions, analyzing answers, and preparing for the worst. Because we were so unfamiliar with the existing state bureaucracy, and because there simply was no state bureau of nuclear crisis management as such, let alone a precedent to study, we did something at the outset which was to serve us very well. In lieu of the existing bureaucracy, I assembled what might be called an ad hocracy, a close team of associates whose judgment and competence I had come to trust, and a support group of relevant state specialists whose judgment and competence were about to be tested under pressures none of them had ever known before. The ad hocracy reported to me only periodically at first, and these reports were sandwiched within other pressing but somewhat routine affairs of state. In other words, we tried to carry on as best we could while still being attentive to the crisis atmosphere that was being created around us. At the outset, we felt it was important to conduct business as usual in the governor's office, and perhaps even more important, to appear to be doing so, because panic, as any study has shown, has a way of multiplying and developing in a crowd much more expeditiously than person to person. So, as we began to try to sort out the day and what was to come, I began to cancel my other appointments, and the ad hocracy virtually moved into my office for an extended and unforgettable stay. Naturally, our first task was to try to find out what was happening at the site of the accident. My training as an engineer and as a lawyer had given me a well-developed respect for the integrity of facts, which was to serve me well through this experience. As I had in professional endeavors, I was to instinctively demand much more of my sources than mere opinion, conjecture, guesswork, hearsay, contradictory allegations. The woods were full of them. But I wanted the facts as best as they could be determined and as quickly as they could be identified. In the case of TMI, this would prove to be far more difficult than any of us imagined. The utility, its regulators, and other groups and institutions appeared to be contradicting one another, or telling the public less than they knew, or more than they knew in some cases. Self-appointed experts began to exaggerate either the danger or the safety of the condition. The credibility of the utility in particular, as many of you may recall, did not fare well. It first seemed to speak with many voices, and then with none at all. On the first day, it's made its debut by seeking to minimize the accident, assuring us that everything is under control, when we later learned that it wasn't, and that all safety equipment had functioned properly, when we later learned that it didn't. And even when the company technicians found that radiation levels in the area surrounding the island had climbed above normal, the company itself neglected to include that information in a statement to the public. The company had also vented radioactive steam into our air for 2.5 hours at midday without informing the public again. So it fell to us then to tell the people of central Pennsylvania, as our Lieutenant Governor Bill Scranton did at 4:30 p.m. at a press conference that afternoon, that this situation is more complex than the company first led us to believe, that there had been indeed a release of radioactivity into the environment, that the company might make further discharges, that we were concerned about all this, but that off-site radioactivity levels had been decreasing during the afternoon, and there was no evidence as yet that they had ever reached a danger point. Although we continued through this crisis to monitor what utility officials were saying, we began to look elsewhere for sources of information that could be more credible to the public as well as helpful to us. Among others, we turned inevitably to federal engineers and inspectors who had spent most of the day inside the plant. 3 of these on-site government inspectors briefed us at the governor's residence that evening and joined the lieutenant governor in a 10 p.m. press conference that was to put a long day one to bed for most members of our adhocracy. I was to prove an exception. My past reading habits would delay what otherwise might have been a deep, comfortable, and much-needed sleep. I recalled reading a book reassuringly entitled "We Almost Lost Detroit," an account by John G. Fuller of the problems at the Enrico Fermi nuclear power plant in Michigan. I remembered Fuller's discussion of the consequences of core damage at the Michigan plant and realized that our federal experts had not raised this issue with respect to TMI during our evening briefing. It's well to remember that in 1979, few people realized that there was no danger of an actual nuclear explosion, mushroom cloud and all, from a nuclear power plant. That isn't physically possible, then or now. The real catastrophe, as outlined in the Fuller book, would be the overheating of the reactor core to the point where it actually melts down and burns through its concrete and steel containment, thereby releasing massive amounts of radioactive material which silently but lethally could contaminate the environment for miles around and for centuries to come. The term China syndrome was derived, in fact, from the theory that such a core would be so hot it could burn its way actually through to the other side of the earth. Ironically, the movie The China Syndrome was running in Harrisburg area theaters that week. What a help. And the script incredibly described a meltdown as having the potential to contaminate an area, this is a quotation, the size of the state of Pennsylvania. Another helpful bit of media. I did manage to sleep that night, but I began day 2 with my new skepticism toward the experts and the industry fully intact. Day 2, the authors of a specially commissioned report were to write much later, was an interlude, a day for the drawing of deep breaths, a good time for members of Congress to put in an appearance, which of course they did. Chairman Joseph Henry of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, meanwhile, was telling a congressional committee in Washington that we had been nowhere near a meltdown, although he had no way of really knowing that at the time. The company was holding its first full-fledged press conference since the accident, telling reporters that the plant was stable and that the controlled release of limited amounts of radioactivity in our atmosphere should soon be terminated. There seemed to be a feeling among those in charge that the worst of the accident had passed. I wanted to believe that. But once again, I was not quite sure. What I did know was that public faith in the experts and institutions was beginning to erode. And it was clear that the credibility of the governor's office was to become much more than simply a political asset for its occupant. That credibility had to become perhaps the last check against a possible breakdown in civil authority and the chaos and panic that such a breakdown surely would ignite. Obviously, we were determined to prevent to preserve that check. The time had come, therefore, for me to become more visibly active and to use whatever credibility we maintained in our office to put things back into perspective, to establish, in other words, that the situation was not as bad as some would have us fear, nor as good as others would have us believe. We all agreed it was time for me to become publicly involved in the office, and I held a briefing, the first one with the press that day, noted there was no cause for alarm, but we were remaining alert, and stated to them, I have spent virtually all the past 36 hours trying to separate fact from fiction about this situation. I feel we have succeeded on the more important questions, although I privately suspected that the latter was a bit of an exaggeration. But I was followed by one of the experts from the NRC with whom we had met, and this staff member, to my astonishment, declared the danger is over, a comment that was definitely not in the script. I learned later that night that another on-site expert privately disagreed with his assessment, and the water samples indicated the core damage was very bad. I quote again. Thus, Thursday ended on a somewhat edgy note, but it was a mere prelude to a Friday I will never forget. That was to become known as the day of the great evacuation scare, the day that illustrated not only the folly but the very real danger of trying to manage this kind of emergency by long distance. It began once again in the early morning hours, when the shift operators at TMI were alarmed by a buildup of steam pressure in a valve. Without approval from anybody, they simply opened the valve and allowed the steam, along with a substantial amount of radioactive material, to escape into the atmosphere. It so happened that at that precise moment, a helicopter was taking radiation readings directly above the plant's exhaust stack. Not surprisingly, they indicated a very high radiation exposure rate, 1,200 millirems per hour, a rate certainly high enough to warrant an evacuation if the readings had been taken in Middletown or in Harrisburg or anywhere off the plant site itself. But coming directly out of the stack, the materials were immediately dispersed. The reading was no more significant than any of those taken in previous days during the crisis. Unfortunately, in a classic manifestation of what I was to later call the garble gap between Harrisburg and Washington, D.C., the NRC's Washington-based executive management team thought that the readings had indeed been taken in an off-site area and decided to recommend that we evacuate all residents within a 5-mile radius of the plant. Also, unfortunately, the Washington group forwarded its recommendation up to us through, and this is where you get pretty thick into the bureaucracy, but the recommendation went through our emergency management director instead of our radiation protection director, the latter of whom could have corrected the error and spared central Pennsylvania from reaching the very brink of crisis which was to come. Even more unfortunately, the emergency management director called a local civil defense director who called a local radio station with the news that an evacuation order from me might well be imminent. I had yet to be informed about any of all of this, needless to say. When the word finally did get to me that a Doc Collins from Washington was saying we should evacuate, I was dumbfounded. I had no idea who Doc Collins was, or by what authority or for what reason he was making that kind of a recommendation. And I certainly did not intend to evacuate thousands of people on incomplete information. For no matter how well planned, massive evacuations have the potential to kill or injure people, especially the aged and infirm, infants in incubators, other hospital patients, and even the able-bodied bystander who, like the usher in a burning theater, happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I finally connected with the NRC chairman, and by the time I reached him, his staff had discovered what my own radiation experts were telling me, that the evacuation advisory was a mistake. The NRC group withdrew that policy, that advisory, and I immediately went on the radio to try to assure our people that the alarm was a false one and that there was indeed no general evacuation. My difficulty in getting answers was compounded by the jamming of the switchboard, thanks not only to the premature disclosure of an erroneous evacuation advisory, but the mysterious tripping as well of an emergency siren that soon had hearts pounding and eyes widening all over the city. People were throwing their belongings into trucks and cars. I'm sure some of you had that experience. They were locking up their shops and homes and packing to get out of town. If ever we were close to a general panic, this was the moment. In fact, the evacuation question was not entirely settled. While relieved that a general evacuation was unnecessary, the confusion which that episode exposed in Washington, as well as at the plant, and the uncertainty over what might happen next troubled us deeply. We began to wonder on our own if pregnant women and small children, those residents most potentially vulnerable to the effects of radiation, yet relatively easy to move, should be encouraged to leave the area nearest the plant. We decided to put that question directly to Chairman Hendry, who answered, if my wife were pregnant or had small children in the area, I would get them out because, he told us, we don't know what's going to happen. Again, another reassuring message from Washington. Shortly after noon on day 3 of the crisis, therefore, I recommended that pregnant women and preschoolers leave the area within 5 miles of the plant until further notice, and that all schools within those zones be closed as well. Current readings, I told the people, are no higher than they were yesterday, but the continued presence of radioactivity in the area and the possibility of future emissions lead me to exercise the utmost of caution. Shortly after that, I was on the phone with the president at the White House. It was time to go to the top. Our two staffs had put aside any partisan interest in dealing with the crisis from the beginning, and rightly so. They had developed a kind of friendship under fire for such instruments. One could almost feel that the intervention of the president sent a very strong signal. I had asked him for a representative to be appointed to deal with us in Harrisburg that would have access to him and would have the ability to answer questions that we might have. Harold Denton agreed to send us that high-ranking professional who could go to 3 Mile Island as his personal representative, merge solid technical and management expertise with on-site perspective, and report accurately and directly to the White House, to me and to the people, on what was going on out there, what was not going on, and why. His choice for this risk, this task, was Harold Denton, my friend, and one of America's great public servants. He was then the NRC's Director of Nuclear Reactor Regulation. The choice turned out to be a near-perfect one, and his arrival later in the day would represent a turning point in the crisis. And you will hear from Harold as part of tomorrow's program, a true resource for you. Harold arrived at the plant that afternoon. We established a 3-way hotline between the White House and our office and the NRC office here in central Pennsylvania. Later that night, Harold and I met for the first time. We spent an hour and a half reviewing the situation. And to me, and I think you will find yourselves equally impressed, it was quite clear that his slow and relaxed North Carolina drawl, I don't mean that to be offensive, Harold, his way of smiling naturally as he spoke, his ease and apparent candor with the press, his ability to speak plain English as well as nuclear jargon, all of these factors were soon to make him the world's most believable expert on the technical situation at TMI, and as I said, the true hero of that event. It wasn't long before his value was put to the test. While he was on his way up to Pennsylvania, his colleagues in Washington finally referred publicly to the theoretical possibility of a meltdown, an accurate but poorly handled statement that caused even the most credible of all Americans in those days, Walter Cronkite, to lead the CBS Evening News by saying, "We are faced with the remote but very real possibility of a nuclear meltdown at the 3 Mile Island nuclear energy plant." One could almost feel a collective shudder going through central Pennsylvania at this pronouncement. Harold Denton joined us for a press conference at 10 that night, put the facts in perspective, lowered the level of concern, and earned his spurs with the press and with me, and I suspect with all my fellow Pennsylvanians. While we did continue to cross-check his observation against those of my own team and the other so-called experts, we quickly became convinced that he was, in fact, as credible as he appeared to be. Day 3 wound down. We felt we were finally equipped to handle the misstatements, second-guessing, and false alarms, but they would continue nonetheless. Harold Denton's long series of press briefings in Middletown began on day 4 near the plant site. Visit we took that morning to join the young mothers and mothers-to-be who had been evacuated to the Hershey Sports Arena that day. And we began to be getting back to normal, we felt. Based, however, on information given to it by anonymous NRC source in Washington, a wire service ran a news bulletin that evening that read, "Urgent," all caps. The NRC now says the gas bubble atop the nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island shows signs of becoming potentially explosive. This fear was absolutely, totally groundless. The so-called hydrogen bubble would explode in the press, but never in the reactor vessel. So we had once again to get on with our task of reassurance. This bulletin, you know how these bulletins run? You're watching a ball game, they run the scores on a ribbon below there. And this thing kept being repeated over and over again throughout every kind of television scheduling. But it had an effect because people in Harrisburg began to stream out of bars and restaurants. Our switchboard jammed once again, and a herd of reporters stampeded into our press office, not for the story itself, but demanding to know if they should get out of town. Obviously, we had to move fast, so we called Harold at the plant, confirmed there was no danger of imminent explosive, no cause for alarm, and he, with sirens and flashing lights, came up to the Capitol building where my press secretary had already banged out on his typewriter a 3-paragraph statement and literally ran it down to the Capitol newsroom. You never can appreciate what the effect of a panic is until you've been in one of these situations and you see how people react. But mercifully, Harold went to the newsroom to talk to the reporters and quiet them down a little bit. Within minutes, stories quoting our statement and Harold's impromptu news conference began to move out on the wire services, and another potential panic seemed to have been avoided. In the course of this so-called bubble drill, we had been in touch with the White House and discussed the possibility of a visit to the area by the president himself. His press secretary, Jody Powell, authorized me to say that the president would indeed be joining us in the near future, and I did. Powell issued a similar advisory out of Washington. That was to be, in effect, the end of the panic avoidance phase of our crisis. President and Mrs. Carter did arrive, and many of you will recall the very next day, and he and I toured the plant together, full view of network television cameras. The image beamed around the world on April 1, day 5 of the crisis, and it had its desired effect. It was safe enough, if it was safe enough on 3 Mile Island for the governor of Pennsylvania and president of the United States, it had to be safe enough for anyone. Over the next days, Harold Denton continued to oversee the cooling of the reactor core and offer progress reports to a press contingent that was fast losing interest in the story. On Friday, April 6th, just 10 days after that fateful opening of what had become the world's most famous power plant valve, I was prepared to tell our people that the crisis had passed and that those who had chosen to leave the area can indeed come home again and the crisis wound down. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But I feel obliged to share with you some lessons that I learned out of this experience, and I've taken the time to set them down. So if you'll bear with me for another 10 minutes or so, we'll see if we can give you some specific insights into what I was concerned about. And these lessons that I recite are not necessarily only good for managing unforeseen crises. They're not bad guidelines for problems of governing as well, or in the business community. Let me try to summarize these. First lesson is expect the unexpected. Be prepared to adjust accordingly. As a governor, I was to find that it wasn't 3 Mile Island, it was the 3 Mile gas lines that we had to put up with in 1979 with the energy situation being such a well. And if it wasn't a water shortage, it was a flood. If it wasn't a transit strike, it was a subway crash. You get it. That's the way it was through 8 years in office. And I'm sure my fellow governors would heartily agree with that assessment. That makes it all the more important to limit the things that any executive should attempt to do in the time allowed on his own. The importance of choosing one's battles. It's implicit in the fact that some of the toughest battles that we have to fight are chosen for us, not by us. Of prime importance in mounting those battles is to ensure that good men and women are in place to handle the planned agenda should the boss become preoccupied by an item that never was planned at all. Lesson number 1, expect the unexpected. Number 2, when an emergency does strike, a trusted adhocracy may indeed prove far more useful than an entrenched or untested bureaucracy. It was not in our job description to function like a virtual grand jury grilling witnesses to a nuclear emergency and then to serve as a worldwide communications center, but it worked. A manager should never be afraid to scramble the organization chart, as in a familiar example President John F. Kennedy did during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when his own brother's advice weighed more heavily with him than that of the Secretary of State or the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Third, be ready to restrain those who, as described by our emergency management director during the crisis, may be leaning forward in the trenches. Helmets, sirens, all thinking solely in terms of doing something, regardless of the safety or necessity. This applies not only to emergency volunteers and staff, not only to emergencies, but to bureaucrats, technocrats, and others, even in the political end of the well. The impulse in government too often is to act for the sake of action, or to test a plan or agency simply because it's there, and those have to be kept under firm control. Lesson number 4, be wary of what might be called emergency macho. This is the temptation to stay up all night holding press conferences and this and then bragging about it. It's important for a manager to maintain a visible and reassuring presence. But anyone making life or death decisions for thousands of innocent people owe those people a mind that is clear and a body that is rested. And it does not come from an emergency macho display. Fifth lesson, don't try to manage an emergency away from the site. This does not mean, of course, that one must be on site personally, but someone or some group must be in charge there whose competence and judgment can be trusted by the ultimate decision maker. Sixth, search for and evaluate the facts and their sources again and again, and communicate those facts truthfully and carefully to the people, remembering that credibility can be as fragile as it is crucial in the cauldron of genuine public emergency. Of course, the fact-gathering task would have been immeasurably easier had we had access to cell phones, text messaging, the internet, video conferencing, you name it, in March 1979, but none of those had been invented and were not to be generally available for another 15 years. We sometimes forget that. 7, respect but do not depend upon the news media. Throughout the 3 Mile Island incident, we developed a considerable empathy for the more than 400 reporters from around the world who were assigned to cover this event. They, having had no schooling in nuclear technology or in emergency management, were pretty much in the same boat we were. Their frustrations mirrored ours as well. Many instances, we had decision makers and members of the media comparing notes on vital issues to ensure both the quality of the reporting and the quality of the action within state government. In a similar vein, we have to, much as we are products of a political process, we have to recognize that there's no Republican or Democrat way to manage a real emergency. In our stewardship of the most basic of all public trust, we inevitably survive or suffer together, and not incidentally, so do the people we were elected to serve. In only isolated cases did I see any kind of partisan interest being expressed to gain some political advantage during this whole event. And I say that about both my Republican colleagues and my Democratic colleagues in both Harrisburg and Washington. Ninth, value and learn from history. I spoke about the Fuller book on the Fermi plant. That proved useful, but let me assure you, if one of my colleagues as governor had already experienced a nuclear emergency like 3 Mile Island and recounted it in published form, that publication would not long have lingered on my bookshelf. And finally, as that well-known American philosopher, the late Yogi Berra, once said, "It ain't over till it's over." Because for the balance of my term, I was to be preoccupied with questions involving cleanup of the damaged reactor, the utilities application to restart the undamaged Unit 1 reactor at 3 Mile Island, and a whole slew of things which continued well into this century. And of course, lessons are still being learned. You wouldn't be here today to hear those of us who are survivors of this process if you weren't curious about and interested in contributing to increasing our capability to deal with these types of incidents. The effect, of course, of the accident on the nuclear power industry in America was devastating. New construction was stopped dead in its tracks, and no new plants have been commissioned since 1979. But we still derive about 20% of our electrical power from nuclear sources, but the added costs and increased scrutiny by regulatory authorities, together with the uncertain future for waste disposal that's been occasioned by the inability to find appropriate sites for deposit, put a large question mark over the industry. We had at the University of Pittsburgh 2 years ago a conference on the future of nuclear power, and there was not much marching in the streets by the people who were the proponents. They believed in their cause, but they recognized the difficulties. This, as you can tell, was a difficult time for all of us in Pennsylvania, but I'm proud to say, as always, that our citizens rose to the occasion and met the task head on, ready, willing, and able to take on the challenges of their day and thereafter and prevail. For that, we can all be grateful and proud to have been a participant in or observer of one of the greatest types of challenges that can come to any state. And we in Pennsylvania not only survived, but prospered, I'm proud to say. So, again, my thanks to you. Your patience is admirable. While culling through all my recollections, I realized that a lot of this was probably pretty well widely known. But you asked me, and I came for free. Thanks very much.